Welcome back to Unshakable Belief. I'm Monica. Around here, we investigate ourselves a little differently. Most personal development asks, who do you want to become? But I believe there's a question that has to come first. Who have you become and why? Because behavior isn't random, behavior is evidence. Behavior leaves clues. Every reaction, every habit, every fear, and every pattern tells a story. When we become curious enough to understand that story, we create the freedom to choose what comes next. Today, I want to investigate something I think many of us quietly judge ourselves for. What if you didn't stop dreaming because you lost ambition? What if you stopped dreaming because life slowly taught your brain that hope wasn't safe anymore? Let's investigate. Over the past year, I found myself returning to a conversation I had with my coach, Rudy, while we were in Kauai. It's interesting how certain conversations stay with you. At the time, you appreciate them. Maybe you even write a few notes about them, but you may not fully understand why they matter until months later when life quietly hands you the missing pieces. Kauai was one of those moments for me. For a few days, life slowed down in a way I hadn't experienced for a long time. There wasn't a calendar dictating every hour of the day, a constant stream of phone notifications pulling my attention in different directions, or the familiar feeling that I was always one step behind whatever responsibility came next. There was simply space to think, to breathe, and perhaps most importantly, space to hear my own thoughts again. What surprised me wasn't the beauty of the island. It was what happened inside me once everything became quiet. I started imagining my future. Now, that probably sounds like a very ordinary thing. Most people spend time imagining where they'd like to travel, what kind of home they hope to have someday, or the work that they'd love to do. But as I sat there, I realized how unfamiliar that experience had become for me. It wasn't that I never had been someone with dreams. It was that I couldn't remember the last time I had allowed myself to sit with them long enough to enjoy imagining them. If someone had asked me then whether I still had dreams, I would have answered without hesitation. Of course I did. I wanted to write more books, speak on more stages, build my business, coach women through the reset methodology, create retreats, continue having conversations that helped women understand themselves with more compassion. Those dreams hadn't disappeared. What had disappeared was the time I spent living with them. Somewhere along the way, dreaming had become something I planned to come back to later. Later, when life settled down, when there was a little more margin, when I wasn't carrying so much. I never consciously decided to postpone my future. But when I looked honestly at the rhythm of my life, I realized that later had quietly become my default answer. The problem with later is that it rarely announces itself. It usually sounds responsible. We tell ourselves we'll think about what we really want once this busy season passes, once the kids are older, once work calms down, once the bills are paid, or once the next crisis is behind us. One season becomes another, and before we realize it, years have passed without ever returning to the conversation we promised ourselves we'd have. When I looked back over my life, I couldn't identify one defining moment when I stopped dreaming. There wasn't a decision or dramatic turning point. Life simply became increasingly full. There were responsibilities to manage, people to care for, problems to solve, circumstances that demanded my attention. Every season seemed to introduce another challenge that felt more urgent than imagining a future that I wasn't even sure was possible. Without realizing it, the questions I asked myself began to change. Instead of wondering what kind of life I wanted to create, I became consumed with what needed to happen today. At the time, I interpreted that as maturity. I thought responsible adults focus on reality. They handle what's in front of them. They don't spend their afternoons imagining possibilities when there are deadlines to meet and people depending on them. Looking back, I don't think I had become more responsible. I think I had become more practiced at surviving. For a long time, I couldn't see that survival often disguises itself as responsibility. From the outside, it looks admirable. You become dependable. You solve problems before they become a crisis. You anticipate everyone else's needs. You adapt. You keep going. People often describe you as resilient because they only see your ability to carry the weight, not how heavy it has become. As I sat in Kauai, something became impossible to ignore. The dreams that began returning weren't the kinds of dreams I expected. I wasn't imagining awards or bestseller lists or bigger stages. Instead, I found myself picturing a peaceful home with mornings that begin with coffee and a good book, meaningful conversations, a retreat where women could exhale, and a podcast studio where honest conversations could happen every week. At first, those dreams almost seemed too ordinary to matter. I remember wondering why I wasn't dreaming bigger. Why wasn't I imagining something more impressive? It wasn't until months later that I understood what those quiet dreams had been trying to tell me. They weren't really about the house, the books, the retreat, or even the work. Every one of them shared the same longing. They felt safe. That realization changed the way I understood not only those dreams, but the life I had been living. If you had asked me what I wanted most, I would have talked about making an impact, helping women, writing books, building something meaningful. Now, all of those things are still true, but underneath every one of those goals was a quieter desire I hadn't yet found words for. I wasn't chasing success. I was longing for peace and alignment. And for the first time, I began to wonder whether those were actually two very different pursuits. That question stayed with me until another conversation with Rudy several months later. We had been talking about why it can feel so difficult to imagine a different future after years of survival, after years of living in survival. That question stayed with me until another conversation with Rudy several months later. We had been talking about why it can feel so difficult to imagine a different future after years of living in survival mode. He made an observation that immediately caught my attention. He said that people who live under prolonged stress often stop dreaming, not because they lack ambition, but because the brain starts conserving its energy. When your nervous system believes it's constantly managing danger, uncertainty, or emotional overload, it shifts its attention towards whatever feels most immediate. Instead of spending energy imagining what could be possible 5 years from now, your mind becomes remarkably efficient at asking a much smaller question. What do I need to do to get through today? This idea stopped me in my tracks. I'd spent years assuming that if I wasn't dreaming as much as I used to, something about me must have changed. Maybe I'd become less driven. Maybe I'd lost my imagination. Maybe I just wasn't willing to take big risks anymore. But what if none of those things were true? What if my brain wasn't failing me at all? What if it was doing exactly what it was designed to do? The more I sat with Rudy's observation, the more I realized it explained something I'd never been able to put into words. During some of the hardest seasons of my life, I wasn't choosing not to dream. I simply didn't have the emotional capacity to hold today's responsibilities and tomorrow's possibilities at the same time. Every ounce of energy was being used to solve the next problem, make the next decision, or brace for whatever might happen next. When survival becomes your primary job, imagination quietly moves to the back of the room. Now, that realization didn't make me feel broken, it made me feel understood. Brody's observation stayed with me long after that conversation ended. At first, I thought it was simply because it offered a scientific explanation for something I had never been able to explain about myself. If prolonged stress causes the brain to conserve energy, then maybe it made sense that dreaming had slowly disappeared into the background of my life. That realization alone made me feel understood. It was comforting because it challenged a story I had been telling myself for years, that somehow I had become less ambitious, less imaginative, or less capable of building a meaningful future. For the first time, I considered the possibility that nothing was wrong with me at all. Maybe my mind had been doing exactly what it was designed to do. As the weeks passed, though, I realized that Rudy's insight answered one question while creating another. If prolonged stress interrupts our ability to dream, when did dreaming stop feeling safe? I had never thought about hope through the lens of safety before. Dreams had always seemed inspirational to me. They were supposed to motivate you, energize you, pull you toward a better future. Yet, when I looked honestly at my own life, I couldn't ignore how often hope had been followed by disappointment. Plans changed, circumstances shifted, relationships ended, opportunities disappeared. None of those experiences happened because I lacked faith or determination. They happened because life unfolded in ways I never could have predicted. As I reflected on those seasons, I noticed something that had been hiding in plain sight. I wasn't looking at one devastating event that convinced me to stop dreaming. I was looking at years of smaller interruptions, each one teaching my brain a lesson it never consciously chose. Every postponed dream, every unexpected detour, every season where survival demanded all of my attention quietly reinforced the same message. Be careful how much emotional energy you invest in tomorrow. Little by little, my imagination became less occupied with possibility and more occupied with preparation. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to stop dreaming. I simply became more practiced at managing reality than imagining what might exist beyond it. That's what I find so fascinating now. Survival rarely asks us to abandon our dreams. It simply convinces us to postpone them until life feels safer. The problem is that if we never stop to examine that pattern, later slowly becomes our default setting. We keep believing that we'll dream again when the next problem is solved, when the finances improve, when the relationship stabilizes, when the children are older, when work slows down, or when life finally becomes manageable. Eventually, we become so accustomed to carrying today's responsibilities, we stop noticing tomorrow has quietly disappeared from the conversation. Looking back, I don't think I stopped dreaming because I lacked hope. I think hope had become emotionally expensive. Every dream carried the possibility of another disappointment. And my nervous system responded the way nervous systems are designed to respond. It protected me, not by stealing my ambition, but by redirecting my attention toward whatever felt most necessary in the present moment. Understanding that didn't instantly restore every dream I'd set aside, but it did something far more important. It replaced self criticism with compassion. Instead of asking why I wasn't dreaming bigger, I finally began asking what had I been carrying for so long that dreaming no longer felt possible. When I came home from Kauai, I expected that feeling to stay with me. I thought maybe something had shifted. Maybe I had finally remembered something I had lost. For a few weeks, I found myself returning to those quiet dreams. I would catch myself thinking about that peaceful home or imagining what it would feel like to create a retreat where women could step away from the noise of everyday life. Those thoughts would surface while I was driving, and for a moment, they felt surprisingly close. Then life did what life so often does. It became busy again. There were difficult conversations that couldn't be avoided, decisions that carried more weight than I wanted them to, responsibilities that demanded my attention, and the emotional reality of navigating the end of my marriage. My days slowly filled back up with everything that needed to be handled, and almost without noticing it, those dreams began fading into the background again. It wasn't because I had changed my mind, and it wasn't because they no longer mattered. They simply became quieter. For a long time, I interpreted that as failure. I assumed there must be something wrong with me. If I really wanted those things, wouldn't I be thinking about them all the time? Wouldn't I be making bigger plans or taking bigger risks? I looked at people who always seemed to have another goal they were chasing and quietly wondered why that kind of excitement didn't seem to come naturally to me anymore. If we're waiting for life to become perfectly calm before we allow ourselves to dream, we may end up waiting for the rest of our lives. That realization was difficult because it forced me to acknowledge something that I hadn't wanted to see. I hadn't stopped dreaming because I lacked vision. I had stopped making room for my dreams because survival had convinced me that they could wait. The more I sat with that idea, the more compassion I found for the version of me who had lived that way for so long. She wasn't lazy. She wasn't unmotivated. She wasn't failing. She was carrying a life that often required every ounce of energy she had. Of course, dreaming became quieter. Of course, the future became harder to imagine. The remarkable thing isn't that my dreams faded into the background. The remarkable thing is that they never disappeared completely. Even in the busiest seasons, they kept finding quiet ways to remind me they were still there. They showed up as a passing thought while I was on vacation. They surfaced during conversations that stirred something inside me. They appeared in moments of unexpected stillness, almost as if they were patiently waiting for me to have enough space to hear them again. Looking back, I don't think my dreams were trying to get my attention. They were trying to remind me of who I was before survival became the loudest voice in the room. Perhaps that's why this conversation has mattered so much to me, because maybe I didn't stop dreaming at all. Maybe survival simply interrupted the conversation. As I've continued reflecting over this past year, I've realized that healing didn't begin the moment I started dreaming again. It began the moment I stopped judging myself for not dreaming. That may sound like a small distinction, but it changed the entire conversation I was having with myself. For years, I believed the absence of dreaming was evidence that something was wrong with me. I measured myself against people who always seemed to be chasing another goal, building another business, or reaching for something bigger. And I quietly wondered why that kind of energy didn't seem to come as naturally to me anymore. Now I see something different. I wasn't lacking ambition. I was carrying a tremendous amount of responsibility. Those aren't the same thing. Understanding that hasn't suddenly made life easy. I still have responsibilities. I still have difficult days. I still catch myself slipping into survival mode more often than I'd like. The difference is that I no longer assume those moments tell me something about my character. They simply remind me to become curious about what my mind believes it needs to protect me from. That shift has been incredibly freeing. Instead of trying to force myself to dream bigger, I'm learning to create more space for dreaming to return naturally. I've discovered that hope doesn't always come back as a lightning bolt or a perfectly mapped out 5 year plan. Sometimes it returns as a quiet thought that keeps resurfacing. Sometimes it's a conversation you can't stop thinking about. Sometimes it's a picture of a peaceful home, meaningful work, or a life that finally feels aligned with who you've become. I've stopped dismissing those moments because they don't seem impressive enough. I've started paying attention to them because maybe those quiet dreams aren't small at all. Maybe they're the first sign that your nervous system is beginning to believe it's safe to imagine the future again. If today's conversation stirred something in you and you're realizing you don't just want to listen to these conversations, but actually begin investigating your own story, I'd love to invite you to learn more about the Reset Founders Group. This will be the very first group of women to experience the newly designed Reset methodology together. It's designed for women who are ready to replace shame with curiosity, understand the stories that shape them, and begin choosing who they become next. You can learn more and find all the details through the link in the show notes. Before we continue, I want to take just a moment to share something. If today's conversation is resonating with you and you're realizing you don't just want to understand your patterns, you want to begin investigating them in a deeper way, I want to invite you to join me for my free live masterclass called What is Control Really Trying to Protect? It's happening July 28th at 7 p.m. Central. The link will be in the show notes. Together, we'll explore why control isn't the problem we often think it is. We'll look beneath the behavior to understand the hidden story it's protecting, learn how survival shapes our patterns, and discover why understanding always creates more freedom than self judgment ever will. If you've ever found yourself wondering why you can't seem to let go, why uncertainty feels so uncomfortable, or why you carry the weight of everything on your shoulders, I think you'll find this conversation incredibly meaningful. I would love to have you there. Before we close today, I want to leave you with one question, not to answer immediately, just to carry with you this week. What dream have you quietly set aside? Not because it became impossible, but because survival convinced you there would be time for it later. Sit with that question. Notice what comes up. Don't rush to fix it. Don't judge your answer. Just become curious because behavior leaves clues. And maybe the absence of dreaming isn't evidence that you've lost your ambition. Maybe it's evidence that you've been carrying more than anyone ever realized, including you. Thank you for spending this time with me today. These conversations mean so much to me, and I never take for granted that you've chosen to spend part of your day here. If this episode resonated with you, I'd love for you to share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you haven't already, I'd be grateful if you subscribe to the podcast and leave a review on Apple or Spotify. It helps more women discover these conversations and join us as we continue learning how to investigate ourselves with compassion instead of criticism. Until next time, remember, behavior leaves clues, and you were made for more.